Now take down your fishing pole and meet me at the fishing hole. We may not get a bite all day, but don't you rush away. What a great place to rest your bones, and mighty fine for skipping stones. You'll feel fresh as a lemonade for sitting in the shade. Whether it's hot, whether it's cool, oh, what a spot for whistling like a fool. What a fine day to take a stroll and wander by the fishing hole. I can't think of a better way to pass the time of day. We'll have no need to call the roll when we get to the fishing hole. There'll be you, me, and old dog Trey to doodle time away. Man, it's so nice out here. I wouldn't care if I was fishing with a naked hook.
Well, old buddy, you might as well be fishing with a naked hook. No more fishing you've caught.
Oh, you reckon you're ever gonna catch one?
Caught more than you have. No fishing rascal.
I ain't gonna have to take your fish off for you, am I, today, you know?
That's the only way you're gonna get fish smell on your hand.
Pass me one of them cold ones, would you? Hanging around, taking our ease, watching that hound scratching at his fleas. If we don't hook a perch or bass, we'll cool our toes in dewy grass, or else pull up a weed to chaw and maybe sit and jaw. Come on, take down your fishing pole and meet me at the fishing hole. I can't think of a better way to pass the time of day. Come on, take down your fishing pole and meet me at the fishing hole. I can't think of a better way to pass the time of day.
You need to follow somebody else. Come on.
You got room to fish now?
Yeah.
Y'all pushing us out of our hole.
Well,
You good now? Do what you want.
yeah, y'all fine. Just stay right over there.
You believe that, Darryl?
Do what you want. Fishing hole. I can't think of a better way to pass the time of day.
That's on my next CD. It'll be out in about a month. How many? I'm sure if I took a show of hands, everybody in here would recognize the Andy Griffith theme song, but how many of you really knew that there were words to the song? Well, a few of you. That's neat. That was Darryl Worley. Darryl, by the way, will be the entertainment at the banquet tonight. And Darryl has partnered up with the agency and our foundation to find some unique ways to raise funds for wildlife agencies throughout the United States. I'm sure Darryl will probably mention some of that tonight and maybe in some of the meetings this afternoon. Which, by the way, we like raising funds because, ladies and gentlemen, to keep this quality program on the air, your kind contributions are things that help us do that. Remember, when you give to wildlife, you're giving to a way of life. Yesterday, thank you so much. I'll be in my booth later. Yesterday, we talked a lot about changes going on throughout the Southeast and what impacts it has on wildlife and what impacts it has on our different agencies. Today, we're going to keep that theme going. We tried to organize the sessions yesterday so that one led into another, and it'll be similar today. So today, we're going to be talking more from the social, logical, economic changes that were going on, more into the political, and then into what it's actually doing into the scientific community and how that impacts us. So It's my pleasure to introduce the person who will be our first speaker and also be our moderator for the rest of the session today. Mr. Ron Reagan is not a stranger to anybody here. I read his bio, but also, I started to say I Googled him, but that sounds so personal. But
I don't know if I like that.
But anyway, Ron is the executive director of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and but prior to that had a long history in the state of Vermont in different positions in that agency as well, including the director of that agency, and later moved into the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and then most recently into his position there. In looking over his background, he's uniquely qualified to talk about the political implications of all that are going on. As 40th President of the United States, Ron Reagan was... But if you are not familiar with AFWA, and I can't imagine anybody in here that isn't, you know that all the things that boil up on the state level on the political side also boil up on the national level, and it's a constant stream of workload that these people have to do on our behalf to look at the climate, not only within the states and how the states interact with the others, but also what's going on the national level. And that's what Ron does. He's a great guy, a great friend to have, and we appreciate him taking over this part today to give us his view on what's going on in the political landscape. Ron Reagan.
Well, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay back there? Great. And thank you, Ed, for those kind words. You know, it really is a small world. When I first came to the association about 5 years ago, Matt Hogan, who was the executive director at the time, said, well, Ron, most of your portfolio is going to be fish-related stuff. And one of the things that popped up on my radar screen quickly was reauthorization of the Sport Fish Restoration and Boating Trust Fund. And I'd never heard of Ed Carter, had never met Ed Carter, but in his role at that time in Tennessee, he was kind of one of the lead persons to help manage the process of developing a platform for reauthorization. And I got to know Ed through that, immediately liked the fella. We developed a nice friendship, and then lo and behold, one day I wake up and learn he's actually going to be my boss as the director of this fine agency. When Ed first called me, I don't know, maybe a month or so ago, and asked me to participate in this session, you know how it is, you usually say yes right away. And then when he said, well, it's 30 minutes, that's a big chunk of time. But when I started writing this speech, I soon realized 30 minutes really isn't that much time because there's a lot to say. So my challenge today is to actually say what I need to say in the right amount of time and keep us on time so that I don't cut into those who follow, since I'm actually moderating the session thereafter. Well, one of the association's core competencies, if you will, is managing or interacting with the political sphere of governmental policy. We try to provide for legislative and executive branch outcomes that benefit conservation, and we're always thinking about benefits to state jurisdictional authority as well. And our strategic plan, which we don't need to look at in great detail, but if you look to the screen, you'll note is replete with indications of one of the big things that we do in D.C., and that's work the political front and work with the executive branch leadership in D.C. to provide for those outcomes that I mentioned. And if any of you have worked with AFWA very much, you know we have a great team of people who address the latest legislative agenda in D.C. on your behalf. People like Gary Taylor, Jen Mock-Schaefer, and Mark Humpert in particular are our three go-to people who spend a lot of time working with the administration, working with Congress, and working with the Office of Management and Budget to look out for your needs and interests. And on a daily basis, they're dealing with excise tax issues, the Farm Bill, energy development, public lands, and wildlife diversity funding, among lots of other things. And in fact, yesterday I called Gary to check in with him about an issue and asked him how things were going, and he said, you know, we're up to our neck on budget stuff, and I'm sure that's true. These people are some of the very best folks to work fish and wildlife issues in all of D.C. They're rooted in history. They understand conservation history in this country. They've come out of state agency backgrounds, so they know how important their work is to each of you. And they have a very good presence on the Hill, and they're very respected. And they never make my life a difficult one. To the contrary, they're always right out in front, making sure I don't make some mistakes. I hasten to add at this point that the association is not a political entity in any partisan way. Our issues, your issues, cross both sides of the aisle. And we work very, very hard to distance ourselves from some of the partisan rancor that some of our good friends, and they are good friends, are sometimes prone to elevate in the political sphere. We're very careful when we sign on to letters about who's on the letter, and we're very careful to ground those kinds of decisions in actions that our membership have taken through resolutions or other kinds of committee work. And so please today, I don't think my remarks do this, but certainly I am not intending to say anything that takes exception to or demonstrates support for any particular party or ideology. And you know, I really don't consider myself a political tactician. I've played in that world, certainly as the director in Vermont. I was at our State House every day for coffee when our legislature was in session, and I've dealt with the sorts of things all of you have in this room. But I don't consider myself a tactician, really. I do, I guess, consider myself a little bit of a conservation historian, and I'm going to spend a few minutes now reflecting back on somebody who I think is really important to our side of the world before I launch into the substantive remarks. Recently, I've been reading about the life of times of President Theodore Roosevelt. I think in the last 12 to 18 months, I've read 3 major biographies on him, including Brinkley's, which focuses on his conservation work, and Edmund Morris's 3rd volume, which deals with Roosevelt following his time in office as president. And you know, one of the things that really has struck me is that he was a masterful politician. He knew how to advance his political agenda despite adverse political barriers. And one of the examples that came to mind for me is actually rooted here in the Southeast. And at a critical period of time in his presidency, and it wasn't in the outgoing years when he could kind of do what he wanted without worrying about re-election and that sort of thing, he really wanted to advance his notion of, or his desire for, landscape level protection of habitats in this country. And he wanted to establish a forest reserve, and as Brinkley says, quote, he wanted to do so without setting off a firestorm of public debate. And when he looked across the landscape of the country, literally everywhere from the west to the east, if he established a forest reserve, as was his intent and desire, he was going to run into a lot of problems and probably run into problems for his other political needs or agenda. And he had people on staff looking for easy wins for him, if you will. And the easy win that they selected is actually in Puerto Rico. And they ended up recommending the 28,000-acre Luquillo Forest Reserve, which is now known as El Yunque, and is the only tropical rainforest in today's national forest system. And I cite that as an example because, as Brinkley said, it was a painless endeavor. And it's a good example because, in my words, he advanced his conservation agenda. He made a statement at the start of a year that he was going to, in fact, conserve land for wildlife, and he did so in a way that enabled him to not run into that buzzsaw or firestorm of objection, which might have led him down to a pathway of no success. Now, we all know that he certainly wasn't adverse to fighting. And, you know, in those cases, stakes or timing, I think, were what really dictated whether or not he was going to bully up or belly up and dig his heels in like he did with the Grand Canyon. And we also know, with another southeastern connection, if there was an expedient administrative way for him to get the job done, he could or would do that as well, like he did with the Pelican Island Federal Bird Reservation in 1903 with his now famous statement, "I so declare it." Regarding the Grand Canyon, Brinkley puts it this way, quote, "If Congress was drowsy, Roosevelt was going to wake it up. If it was operating in the gutter, he was going to teach it to look at the stars." So those were interesting times. These are interesting times. Conservation convictions have always elicited concerns about rights, authorities, values, and scientific merit. And disruptive change based on politics has been present forever, but the intensity of the acrimony and the inability to move national policy forward has certainly increased in the last decade. It was not so long ago that it appeared climate change legislation might have a chance for passage. Now, of course, few in the conservation community would aspire to that goal anytime soon. Who could have predicted one Saturday morning last February, I believe, we would wake up to a plethora of emails outlining the depth and breadth of proposed cuts to conservation funding in the FY11 budget? And who would have thunk a year later we would be facing 16 new state Fish and Wildlife Agency directors, because 16 who were here a year ago have moved on to other kinds of work. And it's those three kinds of centers of discussion, the policy piece, the federal budget piece, and the leadership change piece that will form the background of the rest of my talk this morning. And you know, I'll say this now in case I run out of time to do it later. Gary Taylor was a really big help to me in preparing this speech. We chatted, we talked, we traded ideas, he edited, he contributed some narrative, and I really want to thank him for his help in bringing me to this podium today. And I actually asked him for a quote, and this is what he gave us, and it's an important quote, so I'm going to read it. And on the issue of the intense divisiveness of politics, my observation is that the country is evenly divided between those who are seeking comfort in the ideological poles, rather than moving to the center, where consensus through compromise, though difficult, leads to responsible solutions. And we would be well advised to heed the words of Henry Clay from Kentucky, so another southeastern connection, who observed that politics is not about ideological purity or moral self-righteousness. It is about governing, and if a politician cannot compromise, he cannot govern effectively. Wise words from someone who's been practicing this craft and art for about 20 years in Washington, D.C. Let's talk a little bit about the policy side of the environment in D.C. There isn't any conservation legislation that's having an easy go of it. There are what we would consider easy lifts, such as the National Fish Habitat Conservation Act, but they're stalled and they're likely to remain so. They were in the last Congress, which we thought was even more predisposed to moving this legislation, and it's not going anywhere fast in this current Congress. You know, I suspect many of you know this. The bill creates a statutory architecture for the national plan and partnerships. It codifies the work of the National Fish Habitat Board and partners, including your very own Southeast Aquatic Resource Partnership. It promotes voluntary, non-regulatory, science-driven action to benefit fish, other aquatic resources, water quality, and human health. And you have to sit back and say, well, what's not to like? Well, there is an authorization level, and I guess that would or could give some pause for concern, even though those in the community that are pushing this bill have managed that number downward. And we would think Republicans and Democrats should find much to like with the bill. But the reality is there's likely to be no action, and certainly none, without spending offsets. Another thing that we would think might be an easy lift is increasing the fee on the duck stamp. And when this first circulated on the Hill and had some action, I think about 18 months ago now probably, it was encumbered with all kinds of partisan amendments. And now we learn that even though the hunting community supports an increase in the duck stamp fee, it's unlikely to go anywhere anytime soon. So here you have two apparent easy lifts, one on the policy side, well, both really on the policy side and both having implications for funding, and it doesn't appear they're going to have the traction to make it over the finish line. What's probably more instructive, however, is to look at examples that are really big picture, those bills with multiple policy dimensions that have a fish and wildlife component. Two that come to mind include national energy policy, the second one, the Endangered Species Act, and I'll comment briefly about both of those. Lack of a national energy policy dates back 40 years. And it's not a new issue, but it's one that's become more relevant, if you will, by escalating global conflicts and the price of and dependence on foreign energy, compelling the nation to look at domestic sources for oil, gas, and renewables. And the irony is that as the world's largest consumer of energy and a significant source of potential energy, our country does not have a national policy that directs development, transmission, or use. We bounce from tax breaks for offshore gas and oil to subsidies for ethanol and other biofuels, to tax incentives for wind, but all without any sort of coherent design for knitting them together, combining it with efficiency, and then development or delivery of energy in ways that avoid impacts to fish and wildlife. And so the great biofuels rush escalates corn prices. That raises food prices, and it's done with little foresight or forethought to the amount of water it takes to grow crops and process ethanol. And then the impact of that water use on fisheries resources and the impact on growing row crops on wildlife habitat. Now, we all know very well here that every form of energy affects fish, wildlife, and their habitats, and informed decisions need to be made regarding the balance of energy delivery and natural resource conservation. But we have little national direction and less money to inform those decisions. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill in your backyard down here in the South brought that home quickly with the lack of information that existed on biota in the water column, pointing out that we had no good baseline from which to even assess impacts from the spill. And the real reason that climate change legislation failed in the last Congress and will have to wait for the future is the lack of a national energy policy. In the end, Congress was unable to agree on how many carbon allocations would be assigned to coal generation versus natural gas, versus the transportation sector, versus the manufacturing sector, versus agriculture. All of that goes back to energy development and its national economic implications. Huge issue, lots of concerns or implications for our security and for our fish and wildlife resources, and there's been a stalemate because people have not figured out over 40 years now how to manage to the middle on this issue. And let's move on to the Endangered Species Act. The ESA has not been formally reauthorized by Congress since the early 1990s, again because of polarity. The last comprehensive and responsible attempt was in 1997. Our association and the Western Governors Association played a major role in crafting a bipartisan bill. Unfortunately, that bill was never brought to the Senate floor by the majority leader at that time. All attempts since then at even building a bipartisan improvement bill have failed. And whether the litigation-driven implementation of ESA by the federal courts finally compels Congress to act remains to be seen. It is clear that federal court decisions have both narrowed the professional discretion that Congress intended for federal and state agencies and, in my opinion, has made the federal agencies adopt a risk-averse attitude to making those decisions. Science-formed decisions are best made by the federal and state agencies, but it is also apparent to us that the ESA needs to be modernized with improvements that will enhance its effectiveness at meeting objectives in better cooperation with private landowners. The lack of coherent legislative action may be a contributing factor to the increase in litigation-driven court decisions. In other words, were Congress to assume its responsible, proactive role, state-federal roles might be more clearly defined, and fewer litigation pathways might be chosen. Instead, we're left to situations where Congress is now left to fix issues piecemeal, like it did with wolves in the Northern Rockies this current year. There's lots of other policy stuff we could talk about. We don't have the time. Now we'll talk a bit about the money side. These are austere times. Make no mistake about it. The implications for stateside or grant-driven dollars from the federal government, as well as federal budgets themselves, are huge when it comes to conservation delivery. I mentioned earlier about waking up on a February Saturday morning to a cajillion emails about the FY11 House budget proposal, which had $0 for state wildlife grants, $0 for NACA, drastic cuts to ESA Section 6, and major cuts to Forest Legacy and LWCF. All those things were a wake-up call, to be sure. The good news is the community turned many of those numbers back to something that could still deliver meaningful conservation programs. Early FY12 marks in the House were every bit as bleak as those of 6 months previously. And even though Senate marks are better, everything is up in the air as new waters are plumbed with a debt reduction budget linkage. Gary Taylor and the team are very concerned that Farm Bill programs are especially at risk right now as the super committee and those committees that report to it start looking at mandatory spending cuts. And I would be remiss today were I not to make an appeal to all of you in leadership positions to begin to reach out to and make the case for the importance for Farm Bill conservation programs. On the Sport Fish Restoration and Boating Trust Fund side, when Ed and I first started meeting 4 or 5 years ago on the reauthorization, we actually thought it was an opportunity to tweak the bill and make it better. The conservation community has since retrenched on that and has decided this is no time to think about changes and draw unnecessary or undue attention to a bill that really needs to be reauthorized, and our best bet is to go for what we've got. I've been in a lot of briefings and Hill visits in the past 10 months, and the conservation community in all of those meetings, and to their credit, has embraced the notion of proportional fairness. Conservation programs need to share in the pain, but not disproportionate to other discretionary spending cuts. If you look at this slide, you'll see that conservation only accounts for about 1% of the total federal budget in 2010, with the other 39 going to discretionary programs and then 60% to mandatory or entitlement funding. And if you look over the course of the past 25 years or so, you'll note that discretionary funding for natural resources programs has fallen by 50% in real dollars. But one message I've heard repeatedly from the Republican side of the world in these meetings is, we'll grant you that there are a lot of worthwhile federal programs, but are they worth 40 cents of new debt on each federal dollar spent? There's the playing field before you. The bottom line is we run the real risk of encouraging the mindset that when the economy is good, we can afford conservation, but when the economy is bad, conservation is a luxury we cannot afford. We cannot cut our way out of this economy by reducing spending on conservation. That's what I've heard Secretary Vilsack repeatedly note in D.C. And to the contrary, he notes conservation, in fact, can help us grow our way out of this economy, because conservation spending is good for fish, wildlife, and recreation, and jobs, and rural economies, our economic security, and our quality of life. That's a message we need to hit home more and more frequently. I'll wrap up with a few brief comments here about state agency leadership. Since last November, we've had 16 new state directors. Here they are. They weren't all driven by politics, but most were. One thing you'll note here is there are very few state directors from the Southeast that have come on board newly in the last 16 months. In fact, only Arkansas. And All of these, or many of them, were a complete surprise to us. Some were a shock. But when we look at the Southeast anyway, one thing that we do know is the consistency of tenure in the Southeast, I'm sure, has served your region well, and it's served SEAFWA well, because we've seen in recent years many Southeast directors ascend to very high leadership posts within our association. Today we have John Gassett as our president, and Dan Forster, for instance, as chair of our executive committee. I'm often asked what system works best. Let me just quickly say the default position has always been that if a director is appointed by a commission or a board, that's probably going to play well or better for conservation future in the country, as opposed to those appointed by a cabinet secretary or a governor. I'm not so sure we would assert that with the same amount of vehemence in this day and age. And here's a slide that shows you how this plays out across the country. What I usually tell people is politics plays in both scenarios, and perhaps the best thing to deal with is there transparency in decision making, and is there science in those decisions in terms of continuity through the change that is bound to occur. Let me wrap up with some opportunities. I'll throw them all up there at the same time. Let me say this: we have to place everything in the context of time and not set our hair on fire over any particular political outcome. This is not a unique period of history. Political ebbs and flows are a constant, and they've constantly played into our agenda. Even 100 years ago, it took a decade to deal with the whole issue of protection for migratory birds, and the courts were involved with those decisions, not unlike how they've dealt with some of our day. My first takeaway is to remain constant and committed. Make opportunities out of crisis and wait for better days when you need to. Even though polarity and polemics are strong pulls now, and election year considerations will not provide relief soon, we need to exert leadership through integrity and conviction seasoned with adaptability. Second, our messaging is important. We need to make sure people know about the economic values and worth of the goods and services that you provide in your agencies. And I'm delighted to see the National Fish Habitat Board concretely take steps onto that end at their recent board meeting by having an economist point out the value of the work that they do. Third, and related to that point, we have to demonstrate results, and they have to just not be about the critters or the land. They have to be about people, jobs, and economic growth. Fourth, and finally, partnerships are extremely important. We need each other, we need to stand together, and we need to demonstrate how working together is also cost-effective and efficient. I'm going to wrap up with my friend Theodore Roosevelt. In 1915, President Roosevelt was consumed by what was occurring across the big pond in World War I. And he was so worked up about it and writing about it and speechifying about it everywhere he went, he needed a break. And he actually came to the Southeast. He went to some barrier islands off the Louisiana coast, what is today part of the Breton National Wildlife Refuge. And he penned the statement that you see up there. And in consideration of time, I won't read it. I hope you can read it as I will continue with my closing remarks here. And I think when I read that in a book recently, I couldn't think of a better note to end my remarks on, because it's a good reminder of the value of conservation and how it can and will transcend the political vicissitudes or disruptions of any given age. Thank you very much for your kind attention this morning. We don't have time for questions for me, and I'll dispense with my speechifying role and begin my moderating role at this time. Thank you very much.